Welcome back to Afrique Today. Is still Afrique Today. Like I say, Afrique Today is here to this big event. The theme of this event is Watch Democracy Grow for Stronger and Stable Community. And I have a pleasure to have here Dr. Valentina Okaru-Bisant. Welcome to Afrique Today.
Thank you very much, and welcome. Nice to meet you, Pierre.
Okay, thank you so much to be with me today. Okay, for all of viewers who are watching Afrique Today now, can you tell us a little bit about you?
Well, should I hold this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, as he said, my name is Val Okaru-Bisant. I actually go by Val. It's much more, informal. And I'm a global corporate governance professional. And I actually work on different sectors, economic development, trade, and also infrastructure development issues. So that's basically what I do. And governance actually, has to do with community engagement issues, stakeholder participation issues, risk prevention, risk assessment issues, especially in those sectors. And governance is actually at the crux of Africa's problems. So that's why I got involved in that area. And I'm very pleased to be here today.
Okay, we know today is a very big event, and today I think we will talk a little bit about democracy in Africa and about a lot of stuff. And what are you here today?
Well, today I'm here as an honored guest speaker, and I'll be making a presentation on AGOA, which is the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which was passed by Congress, U.S. Congress in the year 2000, and it was also signed by President Clinton in that same year. So it had bipartisan support from the US. So I'll be talking about the pros and cons of AGOA and looking at how to make sure that African countries actually maximize AGOA benefits. Okay?
Okay, you are a doctor, you participate at a lot of stuff, and you also participate at Africa Economic Growth. How you do that?
How I participate?
Yes.
In terms of my background so far? Yes, I actually teach business and international courses now, and I try to emphasize governance. But in terms of my past work experience, I worked at the World Bank and also on the board of several organizations. So when I worked at the World Bank years ago, I actually worked on institutional legal frameworks of so many projects, so that I was called sort of an institutional specialist, a governance specialist for so many years. And so I've actually utilized that experience in my teaching, which I do now at Catholic University of America. And I also have several years of experience teaching at George Washington, the Elliott School of International Affairs.
Wow, this is very interesting. I see here in your biography, you are a doctor of science of law. From Stanford Law School. Stanford Law School. And you also have a master in international relations. This is very powerful because a lot of African people think a woman cannot be successful. What you can say to young women, African women who also want to become like you?
Well, I'm actually humbled that you think I'm unique, because I think, in terms of my background, what I would say to a young African, there are quite a number of, we've come a long way, let me put it that way, and I think a lot of other women paved the way to give me an opportunity. My mom, of course, was a role model, my late mom. And I think what it is that don't give up. You can do it wherever you are. You know, I actually didn't mention, but I write a lot in the area of governance, and also as it affects gender issues too. And I think that, like I said, I'm quite optimistic. And don't give up, and seek role models, not just women, but also men out there who would mentor you and lead you in the right path. And there's nothing you can't achieve. I have a daughter, of course, and I have high expectations of her. And I think don't give up your role, your feminine role as a woman, but at the same time know that we and men, we are equal but different. That's what it's all about. So it's all about mutual respect between us and men, and not trying to take the role of being a man, but at the same time making sure that you respect yourself and you achieve the highest potential, because there's nothing that we want to do that we can't do by the power of God. I'm also a believer in God, so I would, I'm not trying to convert you, but know that with the power of the Almighty, you can achieve a lot.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And my last question, I forget to ask you in the beginning, where are you from?
Oh, okay. Yes, I'm Nigerian. I'm also a naturalized U.S. citizen, but from Nigeria.
Okay, because that we know in African community, sometimes they don't go together. They cannot do something together. It's very difficult to sit down together and make something powerful. What can the answer you can say to that people that maybe it's better to understand more you work together, more you can grow? How you can?
In other words, you're asking about cooperation between Africans.
Yes.
And how that should be done.
Yes.
Well, this is a forum that actually encourages that. At this forum, I think, are you asking in terms of how can we encourage more cooperative arrangements through forums like this, through social gatherings? And of course, in terms of the African diaspora, I'm hoping that through many different activities, more and more Africans will communicate with each other and exchange ideas. And of course, not even beyond the African diaspora, we also have what the current AfCFTA, which is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is proposing integrating trade within Africa. And I think possibly with that, you're going to have more flow between one country in Africa and another. There'll be open borders, and that would probably encourage more interactions between Africans of, different parts of the world. And I think we were colonized basically by the French and the English. And then we had some parts of Africa that were colonized by Germany, but mostly French and English. And I think language shouldn't really be a barrier for us. Look, I speak French, remember? Je parle français, mais pas très bien. Hein? Okay. J'ai habité à Nice il y a longtemps. Okay. And I'm from Nigeria. Je viens du Nigeria. On ne parle anglais au Nigeria, mais je parle français. Okay. Il faut pratiquer, hein? Il faut avoir d'habitude de pratiquer, hein? Pratiquer, c'est ça. So you see, I'm Nigerian, but I speak French, and so the language barrier should not really pose an obstacle to our communications. And I think with more communications, exchange, maybe students going to different universities, and maybe from Nigeria going to Cote d'Ivoire, and Cote d'Ivoire going to Nigeria, that could actually enhance relations between all the different countries in Africa. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Doctor. With me was Dr. Valentina Okaru-Bisant. She was with me. She's a very powerful woman. And please stay tuned. This is Africa Today. We'll wrap back because we have a lot of speakers today. Just stay tuned. We'll wrap back just after the break.
Thank you.
One of the things I always ask our speakers is there something that is not within your bio that you find interesting that you may want to share? And so, again, it was intimated to me, but part of my intel I must share with you. You would know that Dr. Okaru-Bisant was a former model. And she also had the wonderful pleasure and honor of being an actor or participating in I think a piece that was done by the late Mr. Prince, the one and only. So with that, let me introduce you. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Valentina Okaru-Bisant.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm really humbled. Let me say, I wasn't, I did a little stunt. Let me put it that way. It wasn't a major stunt with the Prince movie Under the Cherry years ago in Nice. And the modeling was just a small stunt because, of course, my parents wouldn't let me be a model, and I wouldn't even want to, endeavor to go in that route. But thanks, that's a wonderful introduction. Yeah. Yeah, just a little bit. Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. Okay, so first I want to thank the organizers, Mary, and of course I want also to thank Larry for inviting me to this forum. And of course, I'm going to be discussing, I have 20 minutes actually to do this presentation. And of course, as a professor, I always know that I have to keep monitor my time. But I'm hoping I can discuss within the first 15 minutes, I can make my presentation and then I can have a Q&A for those who have questions. The subject matter, of course, is on how African nations and the African diaspora can capitalize on the AGOA, market access preferences, and the benefits of AGOA. Now, but let me first tell you, there are 5 subject areas that I'm going to be addressing, and really very quickly I'm going to do like a laundry list in some areas and then leave it open to Q&A. First, what are the objectives of AGOA, and what is AGOA really? What are we talking about when we talk about AGOA? And then I'll be looking at statistics, in terms of African nations and how they fared with respect to AGOA, especially the top 5 largest exporters under AGOA. And then I'll be looking at how African countries and of course the diaspora, the African diaspora, can actually turn some of the challenges that they face into opportunities as they try to, capitalize and maximize AGOA benefits. And then I'll also be looking, number 4, at what the implications are for the African diaspora. And then I'll also be addressing, in terms of my conclusion, I'll be looking at what the implications are for the African diaspora. And then I won't address it, but I'll raise questions as to implications for the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and also implications for China's increased domination in Africa. So first, what is AGOA? Africa, I'm sure most of you probably know, but just quickly for those who don't, it's the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And it was actually passed by Congress, US GOP Congress, Republican Congress, passed it in the year 2000. And then it was signed by a Democrat president, Clinton. So it had bipartisan support and still does. AGOA was then, of course, extended by President Obama in 2015. It's been extended now till 2025. Okay, and what was the objective of AGOA? The Africa Growth Opportunity Act's objective was to promote trade between US and African countries. Okay, and one may ask, is AGOA aid? Is it Santa Claus from the US to Africa? Some people, I know some of my students are like, wow, how wonderful. AGOA, is AGOA a free trade agreement? AGOA, as it states, is actually an act, but it's not meant to create a free trade agreement. It's actually meant to create a preferential, I put in quote, preferential trade agreement. There's a difference between a free trade agreement and a preferential trade agreement, because with respect to a preferential trade agreement, it's meant to, what the US does is that they use the AGOA as a means to influence African nations, in terms of making sure that they abide by rule of law, and they have open markets. So it's used. They have what you call preferential, benefits that they provide in order to entice or incentivize African nations to, like I said earlier, open their markets. So it's somewhat of what I call like a preferential benefits criteria or requirement that they always have. And they do it on a case-by-case basis based on the country in question that they're dealing with. And let me also note that AGOA applies only to sub-Saharan African countries. Okay, and of course we have, as UNDP has stipulated, we have 46 sub-Saharan African nations of the 54 African countries. So it applies to only of the 46 of the 54 African nations. And now, one may ask, how many products are affected with respect to the duty-free preferential benefits that the US provides to African nations? We have over 6,000 products that are covered. In other words, the preferential treatment that the US gives to African nations on a case-by-case basis covers about over 6,000 products. So that's really impressive. But then the question becomes statistics, which is the next topic. Let's look at the statistics on this. I know we don't have a PowerPoint, but I'll just quickly go through. The top 5 African exporters to the US are South Africa, that has exported so far 7.8. This is on the website, the trade representatives website, right? As of 2017, South Africa has exported 7.8 billion, not million, billion worth of goods to the US. Nigeria 7.1, that's number 2 in sequence, right? Angola 2.6 billion, Ivory Coast 1.2 billion, and Botswana 772 million, okay? So you have these 5 countries, they are the largest exporters to the United States, right? But then you may be thinking, how about Kenya? Because I'm sure a lot of people have seen textiles from Kenya. Within these 5 exporters that really have exported, most people might ask, what is the unifying factor or the common factor amongst these countries? Extractive industries. These are in areas of, in terms of the top export categories, you have precious metals and stone, and of course your guess is as good as mine, and I know it's, common sense dictates that that's most likely from places like Angola and South Africa. And then you have, of course, cocoa, that's why you had Cote d'Ivoire, 1.2 billion. And then you have vehicles, of course, 1.2 billion, that's mostly, I'm sure, from South Africa. Iron and steel, South Africa, right? And then you have Nigeria, mineral fuels. Nigeria has petroleum, so that's 11.2 billion, that's a lot, okay? Now, in terms of balance of payments, when you look at exports to the US, the question becomes, how about exports from the US to Africa? US also exports to a number of African countries. Some of those we have discussed earlier. So Nigeria is included, South Africa, but there's also Ghana, there's Ethiopia and Angola. Okay, and this is all from the U.S. Trade Representative's office. Now, to facilitate the process, because we don't have enough time, I want to make sure that I, keep within the time allotted to me. There is, and I think scholars and pundits out there have argued that AGOA serves U.S. national interest and also U.S. security interest in terms of the countries that they go to, and also U.S. using it as a process to influence, as I mentioned earlier, Africa's, ability to and willingness to implement, rule of law and open markets, but also pay attention to the fact that U.S. actually in 2017 ran a deficit of 10 billion. About 10 billion in terms of number of imports or exports to Africa versus imports. So it actually had, a deficit on that one. But there's also an argument that in terms of the total amount of imports into the U.S., African imports into the U.S. is only about a little bit more than 1% of the total number of exports. Overall global exports imports into the U.S. So in other words, the imports from Africa, occupy only 1% of U.S. total imports from the global community. So that's a teeny bit. But having said that, like I said earlier, they're also running a deficit, $10 billion deficit in terms of the number of exports into African nations versus imports into the United States. Now, the next subject matter, given the exigencies of what we have now, which is that we can safely say that Africa has benefited to a certain extent from the AGOA in terms of volumes of exports, especially in the extractive industry. Does that answer our question as to the benefits of AGOA and how great it is for Africa? We still have a lot of countries in Africa that are lagging behind, that need to catch up, and even countries that are exporting to the United States, like for instance, Nigeria needs to go beyond its oil industry to look at agribusiness and other aspects, the non-oil sector. And Kenya, Ethiopia is doing quite a bit now in the footwear industry. They're exporting a lot, but there's still room for improvement because there's still a lot of challenges that African nations are facing with respect to maximizing the full potential. Remember, we said earlier, 6,000 products. They haven't even begun to address, how to, make sure that they really fully maximize exportation of most of those products. There's so many of them out there. So what do they need to do? I have a little bit of a laundry list because of time. I still have a bit. I'm looking, it's 9:07. Where is my conductor here? Oh, Mary's not here. Oh, great. But anyway, it's 9:07, so I'm still within my time limit. But anyway, so going to the issue, the third, as I said, what are the challenges? What do they need to do, actually, African nations? My laundry list has to do with the first thing, looking at it from the point of view of the US, implementing, making sure they continue to implement rule of law and open market policies so as to qualify for AGOA market access, okay? Now, let's look at it from the point of view of African countries. What do they need to do too, okay? It's a tough one because one of the things as I look at AGOA and how ambitious it looks to an average African, what do we do? How do we tap into this market? The first thing on a macroeconomic level for governments to do is that they need to provide a cost-effective, I have a three-pronged approach that I've used, but I'm going to break it down, okay? It has to be cost-effective, it has to be technology-based, it has to be also what I call, I don't want to use too much verbosity, but I talk about having an approach that, here, it's, people use this terminology now, but I'm not sure, if when we open it up for conversation, maybe some economists here can discuss that with me. Transformational economies is what I'm talking about. So we need an approach that is cost effective and also has technology based, and it's all strategy, and is also applies transformational economies. And I think that they need to address also the aspect of the mass youth unemployment crisis that Africa is currently facing. So on the question of cost effectiveness, reducing major cost drivers is what I call it. In other words, the cost of the factors of production, because when you're talking about trade, this is common sense introduction to what they call economics 101. Factors of production, labor, right, capital, land, but infrastructure. That's the technology based. So critical. Without having a developed infrastructure system, just forget about it. Let's just all go home and forget about dreaming about those, meeting your whatever AGOA, market access. Because right now what we have is a situation where most African nations, are lagging behind in terms of access to basic water, electricity, roads, very critical. Affordable infrastructure, because that feeds into production. You can't really run a factory without having those, a sound, reliable, affordable infrastructure. I'm not pushing for subsidies, because now some will say, that's going to affect competitiveness. But you have to have that cost effectiveness with respect to those factors of production. Now, the other question too is developing governments have to develop policies that enable access to sound industrial technology and vocational training. That has to do with the question of mass unemployed youth. They need to be, their energies should be channeled to working in factories, working in agribusiness, working in farms and all. And another critical aspect too is when I talk about transformational economy, developing a strategy that implements a system of transformational economy that creates an enabling environment for converting resource capital, which I call primary products, into finished products. You have to have a technology-based strategy to do that, because that's why I call it a transformational economy strategy. It's a total overhaul, because Africa has been involved so far in, primary products, exportation of cocoa. Look at all the extractive industries. Why? But there's hope, because currently Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana are now looking into developing policies that are enabling the local industries to turn cocoa into chocolate. Nigeria is also looking into not just Dangote alone, but oil, petroleum, primary products into soap and all those, other alternative products. That would really enhance their competitiveness and ability to capitalize and maximize, the market access as provided by AGOA. Now, lastly, the third element that needs to be addressed by African governments, very critical but often neglected also, is the question of negotiation strategy. They have to develop ways in which they can sharpen their negotiation strategy to negotiate with US policy and lawmakers, lobbying, whatever it takes, because that's part of the process. And of all the African countries, the most sophisticated is South Africa in this regard. They're doing a relatively good job with respect to making sure that they're engaged, because I can't, there's a case study, but I can't really go into details, but it has to do with the Section 232. Some of you are probably following what's going on with the Section 232 Trade Expansion Act of the US that allows trade measures against imports that threaten US national security, which is why Trump imposed those measures against China, and which also implicated South Africa, because guess what? South Africa exports steel and aluminium into the United States. So the South Africans were involved in lobbying to make sure that they were not affected to the extent that they could not be affected. So these are very critical areas that we need to, the African governments need to. So I know there's a lot of African diaspora. What are the implications for the role of African diaspora in all this, right? You're all excited to hear what the implications are. Some of you are probably already doing it, but I just want to rub it in a little bit. You could participate, if you have an NGO, or, you could participate in advocacy, you could be doing some lobbying, following up on your country and what's going on, because it takes that, that process is very critical. Let me give you an example. For instance, just recently, Rwanda, it's one of those things, but it happened within the textile industry. It just so happened that Rwanda decided to impose duties on importation of second-hand clothing. It's the US is allowed to, and it was Congress that granted the US president that right. When they signed AGOA into law, the US can actually enforce what you call the preferential benefits requirement against any country that violates the rule of law or does not have open markets. In other words, the Trump administration in this case viewed Rwanda's behavior as protectionism because they were preventing US products, garments from coming into Rwanda. But Rwanda's reason for doing it was because it was affecting the local industry, the second-hand clothing. Believe me, African nations all over, they're importing second-hand, not just Rwanda alone, second-hand because of the poverty levels. So it had an impact on local industry. So anyway, based on that, currently, at the last time I checked, they haven't lifted it. So currently, the duties, the free duty and free tariffs, or not so much free, but lower tariffs that were imposed or granted, or benefits granted to Rwanda was lifted. Okay, so I still have 5 minutes. It's 9:15. I'm checking.
That would allow for a few questions.
Okay. Oh yeah, I know. Thank you for telling me. Yes, that's good. Yes, I know. I said I wanted to. Yeah. So moving on, so those are the kinds of situations that would warrant maybe some lobbying and on behalf of Rwanda in DC to make sure that maybe they regain those benefits that have been denied to them, right? The country in question. It's not just unique to Rwanda, but I give that as a... Mary, you're from Rwanda, so you're you invited me, so I've given you this piece of information, so that's nice. But anyway, in terms of implications, that's a role that the members of the African diaspora can play, lobbying. You could also decide that you want to set up your business as an entrepreneur. So there are formalities for that. And that would require going back to your country to get revenue to the customs and revenue authorities. You would also, of course, I wouldn't forget this because it's very important. The USAID has hubs, 3 hubs in Africa. That's probably your starting point, because if you want to go, like for West Africa, it's in Ghana. The USAID West Africa hub is based in Accra, Ghana. The USAID Southern Africa hub is based in South Africa, Pretoria, South Africa. And then the USAID Eastern Africa hub is based in Nairobi, Kenya. So they've done quite a lot. I mean, they've contributed so far in terms of support. From 2010 to 2018, the hubs created 46,000 jobs, right? That might seem like a little bit, but that's quite a lot. I mean, 1 job is good enough for me, actually. And they've also supported, I would say, they provide logistics, financial, and technical support to those interested, traders, people that are interested in trading and entrepreneurs and all. So they're doing quite well. And they contributed 4.07 billion worth of AGOA exports from Africa. And 491.5 million of that amount was from USAID hub-supported companies, okay? So you may want to go, depending on your region, go to the office and talk to them about, but also about your interest or whatever. Hopefully you would have set up a company and you would want to set it up and incorporate it in the country, maybe some in Africa where you want to, export from. And then you also want to get additional information about the AGOA product eligibility, the rules of origin, benefits, and market access. You want to get as much information. Hopefully I have inspired some of you to maybe jump in and, decide what you want to, if you want to get into this area and, be involved in trading and stuff, and exports into the US. There are a number of documents that you would need to obtain, like the bill of lading, AGOA certificate of origin, standards of certificate manufacturers, certificate for AGOA visa, and if it's a plant, then it's phytosanitary certificate. There are a number of things, yeah? So, in conclusion, I would think that AGOA has been beneficial, I think, to Africa as a whole, but it depends on Africa's ability to really capitalize on what it has and to make sure that it can improve its capacity to really fully utilize and maximize those benefits, and maybe overcome the challenges that I listed earlier. That would really be very useful. And of course, use the youth, very, very critical. Human capital development and turning the primary products to finished products, what I call transformational economy, very critical to the process. Now, please, any questions? I know I have only 2 minutes for questions because I used them. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about China's...
Can you tell me who you are? Then I know. Are you a business person?
I am a small business person in Washington, D.C. I work with children, well, primarily teenagers, and making sure that they at risk youth, making sure that they have an opportunity. Sure. My name is Jackie Carter. I work for a small nonprofit in Washington, D.C., and we do youth development, making sure that at-risk teenagers have employment. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about China's impact in Africa, and as it relates specifically to the textile market and the and employment.
I think you know what the answer is. That's why you're asking. It's rhetorical, right?
A little bit.
There's a plus and no. I always go back to this, that it's not about what China does, or it's not about what an external force, mainstream, emerging donor, whatever it is, it's not about what they do in Africa. It's about what Africans want to do for themselves in Africa that matters. And when I talk about leadership in Africa, it's not even so much about the leadership in Africa. Who is the leader? It's the people. I say we're very lazy constituents. That's how I put it. Lazy constituents in Africa. Okay, because who's leadership? So yes, I know where you're going with that in terms of the question, allegations about Chinese workers being used more than local workers. And, like there's a police force now in Zambia. China has its own police force. And, the possibility that like in Lesotho, in the textile industry, where Chinese markets replaced the Lesotho textile industry under AGOA. It actually suffered under AGOA. That's the infrastructural argument, because China, when they go there, they have the ability to have generators and, they're basically self-sufficient. But unfortunately, that's where that feeds into the narrative of government support to local industries in those regards. So they could be more competitive, because China is here to stay. And in a way, there's nothing we can, really do about it. But we could actually take fair advantage of China's intervention in Africa as a yardstick or bargaining tool when we're negotiating with mainstream donors. We say, hey, China offered us this. For instance, China doesn't have governance restrictions. So some African governments prefer that. But it's not so much a safe one, or should we prefer that, or is there a quid pro quo, in terms of our giving up our sovereign right or sovereign, right to, non-intervention, which China provides, but it's a matter of looking at the big picture of the labor and the quality of the products and all. But in the end analysis, it's a good thing, because the more the merrier, so to speak. Yeah. I saw one hand up over there. Yes.
My understanding is, of course, what you are saying is one part of the story as an African from Cameroon, Central Africa. We understand that those leaders, even if they don't reflect the reality of their country, or they don't do what they're supposed to be doing, work for the public interest, it's because they are a reason. And the US, they understand that very well. You said, I'm going to take a very simple example. We have an Ivory Coast, and you were talking about Ivory Coast. We have a president, Babo, which is in Belgium, prison for a couple of years. Why? Because when he took power, he decided to defend the interests of his country. But guess what? We understand that in Central Africa, as a president elected, when you're not ready to defend 200% of French interests, you're out of the power. They're going to kick you out. Even if the US tried to push the policy, it's at a certain level, they will play the game. And we understand, all of us, that at the end of the day, the US always play a French interest at that stage. I'm going to take one more example. We have a World Bank. There was this Cameroonian working on this special project of mine in Cameroon, and he was defending the Cameroonian interests. But for some reason, all the billion money going into the project, we will never get there. When Mr. Strauss-Kahn was the president of the International Monetary Fund, guess what? They kicked him out, and he's in the High Court in US. And they still struggle to take a decision.
Doing the right thing is what you're trying to
He was doing the right thing to defend the Cameroonian, but the Cameroonian government, because he was an advisor of the board, they kicked him out. And he sued the World Bank. He's in the High Court right now, but he didn't take a decision. But what you are saying, you're right. But guess what? At the end of the day, when Africans want to stand by African interests, it never works. Because if we are talking about Central Africa, France is there. What about the French CFA currency? France always fight. They control the France CFA, and they provide 5% as a loan to the African Central Africa. This is very unfair. But guess what? The US doesn't defend that.
The US doesn't defend the African countries against French.
No, I'm talking that at the end of the day,
yes,
the UN always defend their relationship with France and all the Occidental countries. And I took an example with Ivory Coast, as we were talking about.
Yes.
They kicked Gbagbo out for no reason,
yes,
because he was there to defend Ivory Coast's interest. He didn't want the France CFA anymore, which is very dangerous.
So your question is it sort of a commentary,
I'm trying to
or
understand
you're asking
where
what
is
we
the
do
US
about
position, a real position, if we are there to speak about collaboration and help those countries who is not strong enough to defend their interests. Because at the same time, you want them to improve. At the same time, we're criticizing a leader of those countries. But we understand that those leaders, they have a limited power to fight the French or Belgium who manage Congo Brazzaville or Congo Kinshasa.
My brother.
Okay, yes.
Here, I'll take that. So basically, you offer the triple or the quadruple barrel in terms of the question. It's very
Yes.
loaded.
Yes.
One thing I will assure you is that we cannot do one more, only because we have to respect the rest of the program. But I want to tell you that, first of all, we want to thank
It's a very,
Dr. Okoro.
Can I just give him a quick response, please. I'm a very
We'll take
pleased
30
with your
seconds,
commentary.
please.
Okay,
30
30 seconds. This is the nature of when you talk about what you're saying with the French intervention and, you know, in Central African Republic. Then you talk about the historical dimension of colonization and all that. So it will take a long time, and it's a process. It's going to take an organic, democratic process for Africa to actually untangle the web of colonization. It's not a quick fix. Okay, so I understand where you're coming from, but it goes back again to the national interest question that I was talking about, that countries have to act in their national interest. And I know you're saying that they're acting in their national interest, but who are the people that are acting? You mentioned one person that took action and that there was no support. I think most countries are expecting the mainstream donors, like, you know, the powerful nations, to protect them. Powerful nations protect you to the extent that it's also in their own national interest. There's no Santa Claus out there, unfortunately. So that's just the bottom line. Okay, so it's all about getting your, you know, act together as a country, and maybe the African regionalization process with the the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, that's going to be happening soon, hopefully, because I think 40-something countries have signed, might actually enable some kind of uniformity and strength within Africa to be able to support each other. Because I understand what you're saying, the weaker countries probably have more problems in defending against mainstream donors than the heavier weight nations do. Okay, I hope that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I can answer your question later.